It looks like the trial of the two Michaels is finally underway in Beijing. I think it's being held in Beijing. The two Michaels, I'm referring to two Canadian men who are held in China. As far as I'm concerned, they're hostages. They're political hostages. Um, and it's a big development because it's something moving in this case. Uh, I just want to, I don't want to spend too long on this video. I just want to highlight the obvious differences between how China is treating these men versus how Canada is treating Meng Wanzhou. She is the Huawei CEO who was arrested initially in Vancouver, and China's actions are very clearly reprisal for that. So I want to talk about the comparison there, but I've just seen a video and Peter Humphreys was interviewed. I somewhat know Peter. I spoke to him last year because of my role in the Ofcom thing when I was petitioning to get Ofcom to strip the license of CGTM, which I'm pleased to say eventually happened earlier this year. It was long overdue, but it was better late than never. Um, so the background of this is that these two men have been accused vaguely of espionage. There's minimal evidence for that. The Chinese regime certainly hasn't produced any solid evidence. Uh, Lack of transparency in criminal proceedings is long been a hallmark of the communist regime. But when she was arrested in Canada, it was on the grounds that Huawei had violated American sanctions on Iran. So on the surface, that could, I suppose, look like Canada kind of imposing American laws. But regardless of what people think of her case, whether she's guilty or innocent, whether it's justified or not, treatment of her as a prisoner is very different. Well, if you could even call her a prisoner. I mean, she has comfortable conditions. She has the full freedom of the city of Vancouver. She can move around the city. She has full legal rights, access to a lawyer. She even has Chinese nationalists who, before COVID anyway, could freely protest on her behalf. And in Canada, she will be guaranteed a fair trial. Contrast this with the two Michaels, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, who have had minimal access to a lawyer. In fact, I don't think they've had any access to a lawyer. They've had minimal contact with their families. They haven't had a trial for 3 years, almost, not until now. And their conditions have been quite harsh. Sleep deprivation, um, very little information coming through. It's psychological torment. And Peter Humphrey's experiences, you know, um, if you listen to what he went through, one can imagine the two Michaels are going through this as well. And the sinister thing about a totalitarian state like China is the defendant has very, very little voice. Um, Whereas in the West, there's a presumption of innocence. Now, if these guys are spies, as China claims, then China would have strong evidence for that. But I don't think they really have anything. I think this was a political move. I think it was revenge for the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, and I just think it's a stark contrast. But I find it so galling and so infuriating to see these 50-cent um, little soldiers, these little nationalists, come online to fly the flag for the CCP and condemn the West. There's no comparison. There's no comparison between how she is being treated versus how these two hostages are being treated. And that is pretty much what it is. They're political hostages. There's been a lot of condemnation of Justin Trudeau for his handling of the case, most notably that he's not hard enough on China. I agree to an extent. I think Justin Trudeau is too weak on China. However, people do need to consider that it's like any hostage situation. If If Canada, for example, does what China wants and just releases Meng Wanzhou in exchange for the two Michaels, obviously that would be great for their case, it would be great for their families. But it would only encourage China to continue doing similar things every time a Chinese official is in trouble. For example, Chinese officials being sanctioned over what happened to the Uyghurs. China could very easily just pick up random Westerners and get them on trumped up charges with minimal evidence and then try to blackmail their governments. So people need to consider that. That's why it's such a reprehensible thing that China is doing. It's basically hostage diplomacy. Um, I personally think, as someone who's been to the country twice, I would urge anyone from any Western country to think very carefully before going to China. I'm not talking about the experience in the country, the culture, that sort of thing. That's wonderful. But right now, things are very bad between Beijing and the West. There's no getting away from it. And this is a regime that will not rise above, that will not hesitate to politicize foreign nationals. So you may think you're just an English teacher or you're just a tourist. Um, Probably most people will be safe, but this is a regime that can kind of be passive for a while and suddenly crack down. That's what it does. So the two Michaels would have just been getting on with their lives there. Um, like I say, if China has anything against them, if they've got any evidence that these men are spies, that evidence would be crystal clear and it would be transparent. If I was Trudeau, I would be demanding that China show transparency in this case. I would be demanding that China produce evidence. Um, it's definitely not a time for caution. I'm not sure that it would be right to do a full exchange. I mean, it would be right for the Michaels that it's horrendous to think what those men and their families are going through. But the problem is, if you do an exchange, it just encourages the Chinese regime. That's the problem. And that's the thugs that Western countries are dealing with. I do consider them thugs, in a metaphorical sense. So, I've huge sympathy for those families. I've looked on social media; they have minimal presence. Um, for obvious reasons, they wouldn't have access to Facebook anyway. But we just try to see if their families had any sort of campaigns or whatever. It's not that active on social media, which is a little bit strange. I don't know why there hasn't been more of a concerted effort in that regard. Um, I'm not saying I know 100% that these men are innocent, but I am 95% sure that they are because I know the Chinese regime and I know what it does. I really think if these men were spies, the CCP would have produced something immediately. Now, their excuse is COVID restrictions. That's why the trials didn't go ahead, but they still would have been producing evidence um, if they had something to go on. I don't think they've got anything to go on. Hopefully, the outcome will be that they realize it's bigger damage to them to hold these men longer rather than keeping them. It may well be that they're using them as bargaining chips, which is awful. Um, P. Humphreys was asked a more human question, which is how do you pass the time? He said reading is one thing. It's interesting that the authorities allow them to have books. I imagine that would be curtailed in terms of the content, but reading and getting correspondence from his family, which he did after, certainly not in the initial months, but after a while. But the two Michaels, it's been even more restrictive with them. So that just shows the cruelty of the Chinese regime. Um, it really angers me when Chinese nationalists try to make comparisons because they're either being deliberately dishonest or they're just ignorant if they think it is a comparison. Um, but if I was Trudeau, I would be demanding transparency from the trial. I think that's one method he can take.